What is your favorite superhero fight of all time? What makes it your favorite? Welcome back, Nerd Squad. It's me, Amanda. For me, my favorite fights often happen when the stakes are high and the safety net of the typical tropes feel like they've kind of been pulled out from under me. And that's what we're focusing on today as we count down these top 10 brutal superhero fights. Number 10, Taskmaster vs. HYPERION. This one is wild, especially when you consider the beating that Taskmaster was allowing himself to take just to get this fight done. And yet he did manage to get it done, and impressively so. We get to learn about how he actually had this one in the bag through flashbacks we are shown during the fight, where it's revealed that Taskmaster's preparation was the key. Now it might seem weird that I'm considering Taskmaster to be the hero in this case, but based on what we learn about Phil Coulson's Squadron Supreme in the 2021 Heroes Reborn event, and that whole thing with Mephisto, it really does make sense based on that. In the Taskmaster series in issue number 2, Taskmaster is working with Nick Fury to clear his name, but Tony Masters has to do something for Fury first. He needs to collect the kinesic signatures of 3 important individuals, one of whom is Phil Coulson. But to get to him, he has to go through HYPERION. And in order to do that, he has to first bring HYPERION's guard down, in essence allowing HYPERION to punch his way through Taskmaster. Ouch. Taskmaster, through feigning a loss though, is able to get HYPERION to drop his guard enough to get a single, powerful boomerang arrow shot out. A Hawkeye classic that is tipped with HYPERION's one weakness based on Fury's intel: radioactive argonite, which is basically like HYPERION's like kryptonite, so yeah. Alright friends, before we move on to this next spot on our list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not show us you love us by clicking that subscribe button? I know there's a lot of you out there that aren't subscribed. I'm looking at you. You're not subscribed. Go click it. Do it. I'm gonna wait. Okay, thank you. Number 9, Dream vs. Karanzan. One of my favorite fights I've ever read in any book, comic, or otherwise happens in the Sandman series, where many of my favorite things happen in comics because it's one of my favorite stories of all time. If you've watched my videos on Nerd here regularly over the years, you may also know that this comic is one of my favorite stories of all time because anytime I can talk about it, I love to talk about it. The original comic, of course, from the 90s is what we're talking about here, and the fight that happens in it happens during the first arc in the series when Dream is tasked with reclaiming his symbols of office, namely here his helm, which it turns out is currently in the possession of a demon in hell. In order to get back his helm in the comics, he must do battle with and beat the demon currently in possession of it, one of Beelzebub's, a demon named Karanzan. This battle is described as being the oldest game and is in essence a battle of imagination. One can lose through hesitation, inability to take up a solid defensive stance, and of course, lack of imagination. In the Sandman live action series, this is the battle we see that takes place instead between Lucifer and Dream. However, in the comics, it is Karanzan that conjures up the anti-life in the hopes of finally beating Dream. While initially Dream is badly beaten by Karanzan's move, he ends up winning in the end, proving himself really the ruler of imagination, as what else are dreams really, by conjuring up the concept of hope, which obviously can beat pretty much everything. Some people might not consider Lord Morpheus a superhero, but I would consider his tale overall to be one similar to that of a heroic epic. And for that reason, and his capacity to do great good when he so chooses, I'm gonna include him here. Number 8, Moon Knight vs. RAUL BUSHMAN. So many of the most brutal fights in comics I feel like come from the time period that this comic does, the early 2000s. One of the most edgy times other than the 90s. In Moon Knight issue number 2 from the 2006 volume, Moon Knight takes on and brutally defeats RAUL BUSHMAN. But even before we get to the brutal yet victorious literal face-off moment, stakes are established here, with Moon Knight being pushed off of a rooftop and falling to his doom, or seemingly falling to his doom, smashing his knees as he goes, and therefore unable to get up to defend himself really when BUSHMAN comes down to finish the job. Fortunately, Moon Knight has his crescent moon darts, and uses these to bring BUSHMAN down to his level so he can crawl over to him and finish the job. Number 7, Black Panther vs. Namor. Probably one of the most brutal fights I've ever seen on screen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe comes to us from the recent Black Panther sequel, Wakanda Forever. That's right, we're going to the MCU, baby! In this film, it is T'Challa's sister Shuri who takes up the mantle of Black Panther after her brother passes away, which was changed in the script after the real-world death of Chadwick Boseman, who initially played Black Panther, Prince turned King T'Challa in the first film and in the MCU. Shuri here takes up the mantle mantle as a last resort to reconnect with the family she has lost, but also because she knows it is the only way she will be able to fight against the newly introduced and complex antagonist in this movie, Namor, the Submariner, or NAMOR if you prefer. I love the way that it's said in this movie, NAMOR. When the two do come to blows after Shuri does successfully recreate the heart-shaped herb and becomes Black Panther, Shuri also uses her smarts to take advantage of Namor's weaknesses, creating a device to dry him out, which she places in one of her ships and activates during the fight against the famed Talokan. During the fight, the airship crash lands on a desert-looking beach. It looks real crispy down there, I gotta say. And the two continue their bloody fight, both almost dying as Shuri attempts to prevent Namor from getting back into the water. Through the course of their fight, Black Panther rips off one of Namor's ankle wings, which allows him to fly, and Namor at one point skewers her with a part of the wreckage. Or a spear, I'm not really sure what it is. Looks like a spear, but he also kind of grabbed it from where like the wreckage was. Maybe there were spears on the ship, who knows. Number 6. Thor vs. Kull Borson. Also known as the Serpent and the God of Fear, Kull Borson is actually Thor's uncle, but that didn't stop these two from fighting one another. In fact, their fight was in essence destined to happen. It had to happen, and Thor was fated to die in this battle against his uncle. Odin had attempted to keep Thor safe from this prophecy by locking Kull away years ago. Kull was once actually the rightful ruler of Asgard, the Allfather, but Odin was forced to overthrow his brother after Kull became obsessed with striking fear into both the hearts of his enemies and even kind of his allies. Odin locked Kull away deep beneath the sea, hoping to keep him from ever becoming powerful enough to rise again after he learned that the serpent was prophesied to kill his son. However, even doing this cannot prevent the prophecy from coming to pass. Eventually, Kull would rise up, powered by the fears of the people of Midgard, and choose his own champions, awarding them great power and each their own hammer. Thor would learn the truth of his uncle and with the Avengers do battle against him and his army, dying as predicted in the fight against his uncle, but fortunately defeating him too. However, this is also comics, so both Kull and Thor would eventually return despite their epic showdown and its seemingly permanent results. Number 5. Harley Quinn vs. the Joker. While some still might think of Harley Quinn as a villain, this all happened, I would say, around the time of her turning point from kind of villain into hero. This is kind of when it's all going down. And while the road has been long, I would say at this point in time, at the time of this recording right now, despite only a few years before being declared Villain of the Year, that Harley is more hero than villain right now in her history. So yeah. This fight happened, however, quite a while ago now, but Harley was still enjoying acting somewhat heroically, at least, as part of the Suicide Squad, and coming into her own really as a character, or continuing to come into her own, I would say. In Suicide Squad issue number 15, she faces off with the Joker in one of the most brutal fights I have ever read. And while the Joker technically kind of wins this fight, Harley wins the battle, managing to escape with her life after he locks her up and threatens to leave her there to starve to death with all the corpses of the supposed Harleys who came before her. There is so much about this fight that I cannot talk about in detail because we're on YouTube, but just trust me, it's just because it's also literally that brutal. So if you want to read a brutal fight, check it out. Number 4. Spider-Man vs. Green Goblin. This one ended in seeming death for both parties, and it doesn't get more brutal than that. Add in the fact that Peter Parker was also unmasked during the fight and had his loved ones and neighborhood watching him get basically beaten into oblivion, and it creates a pretty intense picture in your mind and in your heart. Or, well, yeah, I mean, you don't even really need to create a picture of it in your mind because this comes from the Ultimate Comics, and of course they provide the pictures for you because it's a comic book. And what a brutal picture they do paint. This fight isn't just brutal in a physical sense, although it is also that, with Peter smashing a hulking Green Goblin with basically a semi-truck at one point, but it's also brutal in the emotional sense, because it ends with Peter's apparent death. And I mean also Goblin's apparent death. But of course, I'm much less broken up about Green Goblin dying here. No one cares. Norman, you deserved it. In fact, I kind of feel relieved at that part. While this wouldn't be the end for either character, this battle is still one that stands out to me as one with heightened stakes, where the characters feel right on the precipice of death almost throughout, until they actually and tragically cross over to the other side. Number 3. Batman vs. Superman. An iconic fight in the comics that made its way to the big screen. Granted, on the big screen, I don't know how iconic this fight was for me, but at the end of the day, the fact that it even made it there just goes to show the impact it had on readers. This fight doesn't even come from the main continuity, hailing instead from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns continuity of Earth 31. But it was so brutal and impactful that it was still incorporated into the main continuity, or the likely, I guess, to be former main continuity of the DCEU. Here, two heroes fight against one another, and one of them doesn't even have any powers to speak of. Batman at this point is not only still powerless, but is also, or I guess was also, retired. He returns from retirement, however, and as a result, Superman is basically tasked with taking him out by the President. But Batman isn't prepared to go down without a fight, and a bloody, brutal, and desperate battle ensues between the two at the end of the story that we later find out Batman seemingly won in his own sly Batman way. While Batman seemingly dies and is unable to finish the fight, with the strain being too much on his heart and him collapsing, we later learn at the funeral that he is still alive and well, and that Clark may have even been in on this ploy. At the very least, he seems to be in on it by the end of the story. Number 2. Hawkeye versus the Liberators. As you'd expect, this list wouldn't be much without me diving into the world of the Ultimates. And what a perfect time for it too, as the Ultimate line is due to make its return in comics this year. There's so many brutal fights in the Ultimates, with Jonathan Hickman heading the return of the Ultimates line. Like many, I too am excited about this, so I thought why not dive back into some of the most brutal Ultimates fights we've ever witnessed. This one comes to us from before Jonathan Hickman's time working on the line, but was delivered to us by the dynamic and often brutal duo of Mark Millar and Brian Hitch. And Brian Hitch will be returning, so fun facts. It does fit right in on this list because it's just that brutal. The fight happened after Hawkeye of the Ultimates team was kidnapped by the Liberators. After learning of what happened to his family and being mocked, tormented, and questioned, Hawkeye finally manages to strike back against his captors with the only weapon he has at the time, his fingernails. And we're not talking about Clint clawing his way out of this. Oh no, we're talking about him using his fingernails as projectiles when combined with his deadly accuracy, which basically allow him to take out an entire group of Liberators and successfully escape. He kills people with his fingernails. Number 1. MERA versus AQUAMAN. MERA and AQUAMAN are often presented as being romantic partners, and sometimes as a crime-fighting Atlantean duo as well. However, this doesn't mean that they never fight. And during the Blackest Night, they actually had some pretty good reason to. At that time, AQUAMAN had been possessed by the Black Lanterns, joining their forces, and MERA was driven into a rage by the death of the last standing family member she had, Tempest, causing her to become a Red Lantern. During one page in Green Lantern issue number 50 from the 2005 volume of that series, MERA takes on the deceased Arthur Curry, and when he attempts to win her over through what I can only describe as weird kind of empathy, I imagine trying to distract her from her rage by attempting to bond with her over the loss of their son. This, however, fails to work, and MERA frightens him off masterfully, responding, "I never wanted children," before seemingly killing them both with her blood, which as a Red Lantern was transformed at the time into liquid napalm, because that's how it be for Red Lanterns. That's all the time we have for these amazingly epic and brutal fights today. Let us know in the comments which one is your favorite. I will see you in the next video, but until then, you stay nerdy, YouTube.